What happens when a quiet high school student outsmarts his teachers with a single question? Imagine being so clever that you trap your teachers in their own test, forcing them to question everything they thought they knew. No tricks, no shortcuts, just pure brilliance. This isn't a story about cheating, it's about shaking up the system and proving that sometimes the smartest person in the room isn't the one with the loudest voice, but the one who dares to ask the hardest questions. Stay tuned to see how one student turned the tables on his entire class. At Hillside High School, nestled in the heart of a small town, most students blended into the fabric of everyday life. Among them was Jake, a quiet and reserved student who seemed like just another face in the crowd. But if you looked a little closer, you'd see that Jake wasn't like the others. While most students were focused on acing their exams and impressing teachers, Jake had a different agenda, one that didn't involve following the rules but instead bending them. He wasn't known for being outspoken, nor did he have a reputation for being a class clown. In fact, Jake rarely spoke up in class. He was the type of student who would sit at the back, his glasses perched low on his nose, eyes constantly flicking between the teacher and the notes he was scribbling down. It wasn't that Jake wasn't interested in school, it was that he saw things differently. While others were caught up in grades and popularity, Jake was fascinated by the way people thought, especially as teachers. He observed their teaching patterns, how they structured exams, and the way they explained concepts. What struck him was how predictable everything was. Teachers seemed to follow a pattern, a rhythm that, if you paid attention, you could learn to navigate. Jake wasn't just another student memorizing textbooks. He was a master at reading between the lines. And that's when it hit him: he could outsmart them, not by being the smartest, but by understanding the flaws in their methods. His quiet demeanor masked the sharpest mind in the room. He had a plan. The teachers never suspected it, but Jake was about to show them what it truly meant to be outwitted by the most unlikely of sources. Jake's plan didn't materialize overnight. It had been brewing for weeks, a quiet obsession, one that consumed his thoughts during every class. His teachers had no idea that the shy kid at the back of the room was studying them just as much as he studied his textbooks. Jake was determined to do something that had never been done before. He wasn't interested in just passing his exams. He wanted to turn the tables on his teachers, to show them that there was more to education than simply providing answers. There were questions that could unravel the very fabric of their teaching. It all started one day in his math class. The teacher, Mrs. Langley, was explaining a concept on summing integers. The sum of the first 10 integers is 55, she said confidently, writing the formula on the board. Jake had heard this many times before. It was an old, trusted formula, one that every student in the class memorized without question. But something about it nagged at him. Mrs. Langley had never really explained why that sum was so significant. It was just something they accepted as truth. That's when it hit Jake. What if he could manipulate this simple fact into something far more complex, a question that would make the teachers rethink their own assumptions? He wasn't looking to trick them with something random or obscure. No, Jake's idea was more elegant than that. He would create a question so subtly tricky that the teachers wouldn't even see it coming. The question would look simple, almost too easy, but it would have a flaw hidden deep within its logic, a flaw that no one would expect to find. Jake began drafting the question on the back of his notebook, scribbling out equations and reworking numbers in his spare time. He had to get it just right. It had to be clear, concise, and yet undeniably complex. After all, the best tricks weren't the loudest or the most complicated ones. They were the ones that made you question everything you thought you knew. He played with the numbers, changing small variables in the sums, tweaking them in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious. If the sum of the first 10 integers is 55, he wrote, and a student were to double that sum and subtract 1, what would the result be? Jake paused for a moment. That sounded perfect. It was a simple question, one that any student would be able to answer, but here was the catch. The number Jake had just given wasn't correct. By doubling 55 and subtracting 1, the answer would be 109, but there was an important catch. Jake had embedded the question with a flaw in logic. The sum of the first 10 integers was just an accepted fact. No one questioned it, yet when it was altered, it revealed the cracks in how this piece of knowledge was being conveyed. What Jake had done was brilliant. He hadn't just written a trick question for the sake of mischief. He had created a question that would force the teachers to examine the foundations of their own teaching. The flaw wasn't in the numbers themselves, but in the way they were being taught. How students were expected to memorize answers without understanding the underlying logic. But Jake wasn't finished yet. He thought carefully about how the teachers might approach the problem. They would try to calculate the result, of course. They might even question the answer. But none of them would expect the question to reflect their own oversights. This, Jake thought, would be his masterpiece, a subtle, yet powerful message about how knowledge and assumptions could be easily manipulated if not carefully examined. Now, with his question ready, Jake couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. It was time to see if his teachers were as clever as they thought they were. Would they be able to see through his design, or would they fall into the trap he had so carefully laid out? The exam was only a few days away, and Jake was ready to find out. The day of the final exam had arrived, and the tension was thick in the air at Hillside High School. For most students, it was just another test to survive another hurdle before summer break. But for Jake, it was the moment of truth, the culmination of his quiet rebellion against the system. As the bell rang and students filed into the classroom, Jake took his seat at the back, his heart beating a little faster than usual. This wasn't just any exam, it was his chance to see if his plan would work. The room was filled with the usual pre-test murmur, students exchanging nervous glances, flipping through their notes one last time, trying to cram in anything they might have missed. But Jake sat still, calm and collected. He didn't need to rush. The test was a formality now. He had already won. Mrs. Langley, the math teacher, entered the room and began distributing the exam papers. Jake's gaze fell upon the paper as she handed it to him. His eyes immediately flicked over the questions, scanning for his creation. And there it was, right in the middle, bold and glaring in its simplicity. His carefully crafted question, the question he had designed to expose the cracks in their teaching methods. As the class settled into the rhythm of the exam, Jake couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in the teacher's behavior. Mrs. Langley walked up and down the aisles, her eyes darting over the students' answers, but every time she passed Jake's desk, she lingered a moment longer, her gaze falling on the question he had written. She looked at it, then looked away, then looked back. Jake could see the flicker of confusion in her eyes. She was trying to make sense of it. Her confident stride faltered just a little, and Jake knew that she had been caught off guard. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Several students, trying to maintain their focus on their work, couldn't resist peeking over at the question. Jake could see their eyes widen in confusion as they tried to figure out what he had written. But they were missing the bigger picture. They didn't see the flaw he had so carefully hidden. They just saw another difficult question. The tension in the room grew as the minutes ticked by. The other students were busy filling in their answers, while Mrs. Langley began to walk among them, scanning over their work. But when she reached Jake's desk, she paused. She read his question again. Then she read it once more, her face contorted, in concentration. She tried to calculate it, first in her head, then on paper. Her hand reached for the calculator, but she stopped short. Something didn't add up. Her brow furrowed deeper, and for the first time that morning, Jake saw a look of uncertainty cross her face. For a brief moment, Mrs. Langley hesitated. She glanced around the room as if searching for confirmation, but her fellow teachers were equally stumped. The others had already moved on to the next sections of the exam, but it was clear that none of them had anticipated this. None of them had expected to be challenged in such a subtle, yet brilliant way. They were the ones being tested now. Jake couldn't help but smile to himself. He had expected them to struggle with the question, but he hadn't anticipated just how deeply it would unsettle them. It wasn't that they couldn't solve it. It was that they were caught in their own web of assumptions. The flaw in the question wasn't in the math, it was in their understanding of how math was taught. By altering the sum of the first 10 integers in a seemingly innocuous way, Jake had forced them to confront the simplicity of their own approach. As the final minutes of the exam ticked away, Jake continued to watch his teachers. Mrs. Langley, who had always prided herself on being the best at her craft, was now lost in thought. She began to look over her notes again, trying to figure out where she had gone wrong. Meanwhile, the other teachers began to whisper among themselves, sharing their confusion. The certainty they had once carried with them into the classroom had been shattered. They were no longer the ones in control. They were the ones being tested, and the quiet, unassuming student in the back of the room had just turned the tables. For Jake, it was the perfect moment. He knew he had succeeded, not by being smarter than them, but by showing them that even the most well-crafted plans could be vulnerable to the most subtle of flaws. He hadn't just outsmarted his teachers, he had made them question their own methods, their own assumptions. The true power of education wasn't in memorizing facts. It was in the ability to challenge and to think critically. And Jake had just proven that, in the most unexpected of ways. The exam had ended, and the students filed out of the classroom, some relieved to be done with their finals, others still fumbling with their last-minute answers. But for Jake, the real test was just beginning. He had planted his seed, and now it was up to the teachers to decipher it. He knew it would take them a while to figure it out. After all, it wasn't a question that could be answered quickly, nor was it a mistake that could be easily spotted. It was a subtle disruption in their understanding, and Jake was eager to see how long it would take before the teachers realized they had been outsmarted. Back in the faculty room, the teachers began gathering around the papers. The room, normally filled with the hum of post-exam chatter, had a strange, uneasy silence. Mrs. Langley had the first stack of papers in front of her, and as she skimmed through the answers, she came across Jake's question. Her expression shifted from confidence to confusion, and then to frustration. She stared at the numbers, redoing the calculations in her head, as if she had missed something. "Something's not right," Mrs. Langley muttered under her breath, her brow furrowed in concentration. She scribbled down the numbers on her notepad, trying to make sense of it. The sum of the first 10 integers is 55, doubling it and subtracting 1, that's 109. But that doesn't seem to add up. Her voice caught the attention of the other teachers, and soon they gathered around, peering over her shoulder to read the question. Some tried to solve it quickly, while others took their time to dissect it more carefully. But the answer wasn't as simple as they had expected. The more they looked at it, the more they realized something was wrong, but they couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. The other questions on the exam seemed fine, but Jake's question was different. It didn't just challenge their knowledge, it questioned their approach to teaching. "What are we missing?" one of the teachers, Mr. Green, asked, glancing at Mrs. Langley for an explanation. But she didn't have one. They all looked at each other, stumped. The flaw wasn't in the math. It was in the very way they had taught the concept. It was the assumption that the sum of the first 10 integers was just a given fact, never to be questioned. Jake had executed his plan brilliantly. The question wasn't meant to trick them with complex math or obscure logic. It was meant to reveal the gaps in their own understanding, gaps they never even knew existed. It wasn't a failure of their knowledge, but rather a challenge to the way they taught it. The flaw Jake had built into the question was subtle but powerful. It forced the teachers to confront the fact that they had been teaching their students to memorize numbers and formulas without ever truly explaining the deeper significance behind them. As the minutes passed, the teachers began to discuss it more intensely, trying to understand why the question was so puzzling. Some speculated that Jake might have made a mistake, but as they dug deeper, they realized it wasn't a mistake at all. The mistake was theirs. They had been too focused on delivering content without engaging in the kind of critical thinking that they had tried to instill in their students. "I think we've been teaching it wrong," Mrs. Langley admitted, her voice tinged with a mix of frustration and revelation. "We've been so focused on the answers that we didn't stop to ask why those answers work in the first place." At that moment, Jake's quiet revolution had begun. What he had done was more than outwit his teachers. It had forced them to reassess their own teaching methods, their own assumptions about knowledge. It wasn't about trickery, it was about creating a question that exposed their blind spots. They had fallen into the trap of thinking that knowledge was a static thing, something that could be handed down without question. Jake had shown them that knowledge should be dynamic, fluid, and open to challenge. The revelation spread like wildfire through the faculty room. The teachers now understood the lesson Jake had carefully crafted for them. They weren't angry, but they were humbled. What they had learned was more valuable than any exam score or curriculum guide. True education wasn't just about teaching facts, it was about fostering an environment of curiosity, inquiry, and critical thinking. For Jake, this was more than a victory. It was a lesson in itself, not just for his teachers, but for everyone who ever underestimated his quiet brilliance. His subtle challenge had shaken their assumptions, leaving them to rethink how they approached teaching and learning. And in the process, Jake had earned something far more important than recognition. He had earned the respect of the very people who had never thought twice about him before. The day after the exam, Jake was summoned to the principal's office. Word had spread like wildfire through the school about the quiet genius who had managed to stump not just his classmates, but the teachers themselves. At first, Jake wasn't sure whether he was in trouble or being praised, but as he walked into the principal's office, he was greeted with an unexpected smile from Mr. Thompson. "You're not in trouble, Jake," Mr. Thompson said with a chuckle, motioning for him to sit down. "Quite the opposite, actually. Your question has caused quite the stir." Jake, still unsure of what was going on, took a seat. The principal explained that the teachers had spent hours trying to decode the question, only to realize they had been caught in their own assumptions. They were impressed not just by the cleverness of the question, but by the lesson it taught them. Jake had managed to challenge them in a way they'd never expected, forcing them to reconsider the way they taught. This wasn't just a student. This was a student who made everyone around him better. "The teachers are already planning changes," Mr. Thompson continued. "They're talking about making the lessons more interactive, questioning the why behind the facts they teach, instead of just the what. And you know what, Jake? You've sparked something big here. It's not just about math, it's about critical thinking." Jake felt a rush of pride. He hadn't intended to overthrow the system. He had just wanted to make a point. But in doing so, he had unlocked something far more powerful, a change in perspective. His teachers were now ready to embrace new ways of teaching, ones that encouraged students to think critically, ask questions, and challenge assumptions. In the weeks that followed, Jake's quiet rebellion became the talk of the school. His classmates looked at him differently, some even seeking his advice on how to think outside the box. The teachers, too, started to change their approach, fostering an environment where critical thinking was celebrated, not just memorization. Jake's victory wasn't just in outsmarting the teachers, it was in showing everyone that real learning, it starts with questioning, not accepting. His legacy wasn't one of trickery, but of thoughtfulness, and that was the lesson that would resonate long after the final exam. And there you have it, proof that sometimes the quietest voices have the most powerful impact. Jake didn't just outsmart his teachers, he made them rethink everything about teaching and learning. So, what's the takeaway? Never underestimate the power of asking the right question. If you enjoyed this twist on the classic classroom story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Who knows? Maybe the next genius move will be yours. See you in the next story.